And what in heaven's name brought you to Casablanca?
My health. I came to Casablanca for the waters.
The waters? What waters? We're in the desert.
I was misinformed.
So Matt, you described Terraform as a universal tech investment. Could you expand on that?
Sure, Phil. Terraform is a new investment company that focuses only on one type of asset, an asset that will benefit from the growth and convergence of virtually all exponential technologies. As you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about technology in the context of investing. In other entities, we've invested in AI, robotics, reproductive health, synthetic biology, fintech, and these are direct venture investments in private companies. And though we have done very well with them, they are risky. Most of them have binary outcomes. Some will explode in value while others go to zero. So for example, one of our drone companies has given us an 8-fold return in the past year, while one of our AI companies went bust over the same time. So each of these investments carries technological risk, operational risk, and competitive risk. In an ideal world, there would be a traditional investment that carries virtually none of these risks, but would still benefit indirectly from the broad growth of exponential industries. So here I'm talking about second-order effects, which in some cases can actually be more powerful value drivers than the direct first-order effects. It would also be nice if that asset that we're thinking of was currently super cheap and even hated.
And you're confident you found that?
I am. It became clear to me about 3 years ago while researching solar energy and desalination technologies. At first it may sound foolish, and if it does, that tells you exactly why it's such a contrarian play and why it's still so cheap.
Okay. Could you walk us through your investment idea?
Sure, we're buying arid land, from deserts to grasslands, with a focus on the southwestern US.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, the obvious and primary problem with desert land is a lack of water. If you can irrigate the southwestern US at an economic cost, then the land can be residentially developed or used in agriculture, and that would result in at least a tenfold gain in value on the conservative side.
Okay. So where's this water going to come from?
It will come from coastal desalination plants in California and Texas and in Mexico from the Gulf of California. As you know, California has been suffering from major drought issues over the last decade, and most of the Southwest is already very arid. California is in the early stages of a major desalination build-out. Now, they don't actually have to pipe water across the Sierra Nevada mountains or south around them. If they simply reduce their reliance on the Colorado River, a huge amount of fresh water comes online for the other states.
Okay. But at this scale, how feasible is that?
Well, desalination already provides 4% of the global population with their fresh water. This occurs in places like the Middle East, South Africa, and Australia, countries that are very arid and lack enough fresh water to support the population. In the Middle East, Israel, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia each get over 50% of their fresh water from desalination. Kuwait is at 100%.
So you think we're eventually going to be doing that here in the US?
Yeah, at the right price, we will. The current price of desalinated water is about 80 cents per cubic meter, which is already cheaper than current water rates in the Southwest region. At 50 cents per cubic meter, desalination becomes a no-brainer. Based upon a cost curve which is already falling about 10% per year, we'll easily hit that level within 5 years.
Okay. So what's driving the price lower?
Energy. The big problem with desalination is that it's energy intensive, but new filtration technologies are being developed that are far more energy efficient, and the cost of energy itself is falling at 20% per year. I can get into the specific technologies, but for the sake of time, I'll just show you the relevant cost curves. Here's desalination capacity growth by year. And here's solar energy growth and cost per kilowatt hour by year.
Wow. Both curves look exponential.
They are exponential. The solar cost curve is actually declining by 20% per year, which is about half the rate of Moore's law. This chart says 16%, but that's already proven to be way too low. See how it says that unsubsidized solar power will reach 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour in 2035?
Sure.
So Chile just opened a solar farm in 2018, this year, producing at about 2.2 cents per kilowatt hour, and that's unsubsidized. So that's about 17 years ahead of schedule. What's underappreciated is that the rate of change in the performance to cost curve is itself rising each year.
Okay, so just to be clear, you're saying that the rate of change itself is accelerating. In other words, the second derivative is positive, correct?
Exactly.
Okay, awesome. One item though, this chart shows that the cost of solar energy is declining every year, but that's just solar, not all energy, right?
Right, and in order to compete with this new energy source, fossil fuels will have to fall in lockstep to remain cost competitive. There's no reason to pollute unless that energy is cheaper than solar. Thus, the solar cost curve will dictate the cost of energy across the board.
Okay, that makes sense. So are we talking about just utility scale solar or also residential rooftop solar?
We're talking about both. Utility scale solar is plummeting in cost and capacity is doubling every 2 years. Right now, unsubsidized utility scale solar is less expensive in almost all climates than natural gas or coal. Even individual rooftop solar has fallen below grid parity in sunny states, and that will be true for all states but Alaska within 2 years. And once that happens, solar in all forms will be broadly cheaper than coal and natural gas. Ultimately, I prefer rooftop solar. When you combine rooftop solar with new battery technologies, like Tesla's Powerwall, you get total independence from the grid and you don't lose any energy to transmission, which very soon will mean that all forms of grid energy will be more expensive than just rooftop solar. I mean, would you pay for more expensive energy from the grid if you could generate it on your roof at a cheaper cost?
Not unless the grid energy is more reliable.
Right. Well, when you add in the new battery technology like the Tesla Powerwall, rooftop solar is already more reliable than utility power because you don't need to worry about falling trees, taking out power lines, or any other disruptions. You can be totally off grid for a cheaper cost than anything else.
Okay, so right, it would be basically unnecessary to build any electricity utility lines out to new developments, provided you could just get your electricity off your rooftops.
Exactly. And building out existing utility infrastructure is a big expense that could be totally avoided using solar microgrids.
Okay, got you. So can all this cheap energy be used to power desalination at an economic price?
Yeah, actually, about 40 to 50% of the cost of desalinating water is direct electricity usage. So if electricity costs drop by 20% per year, as they have so far, then the cost of desalinating water will drop by at least 8% per year from that single input. Now keep in mind that I'm assuming no new breakthroughs in filtration, plant automation, building technologies, AI for site planning, falling raw material costs, economies of scale as desalination grows dramatically, or anything else. These are all real factors, but I'm just talking about the energy cost because it's the most obvious single input. If you think about it, if energy were free and unlimited, you could terraform the Earth however you wanted. But well before then, energy will be cheap enough to begin mass desalination. Right now, we're right at the tipping point with 4% of the world getting its fresh water directly from desalination. So keep in mind too that you don't need to reach 100% to hit complete market saturation. Only 35% of the world's land surface is desert. So to reach full global saturation, 35% penetration would be more than sufficient. So looking only in the rearview mirror and assuming no additional breakthroughs going forward, like graphene filters which perfectly separate H2O from all other molecules in a single step, or metallic organic frameworks which can remove lithium and other high-value elements from ocean water, desalination capacity will grow by at least 10% per year, its average growth rate since 2005. A more accurate figure, in my opinion, comes from BCC Research, which estimates that desalination capacity will grow by roughly 18% per year over the next 5 years. At that rate, you would fully irrigate all the world's deserts in just 13 years. Obviously, deserts in richer countries, like the US, would commence and saturate sooner. Of course, this is all dependent upon cost, which has only recently fallen below what I would call water grid parity in parts of the US. This is a key milestone, and it's one of the reasons I believe capacity growth will actually be much higher going forward. I would estimate 20 to 25% forward growth, which gets you to full worldwide saturation before 2028. So just to repeat, the primary reason for the pushback against desalination today is the cost. But the cost is falling by at least 8% per year, which means that a certain amount of opposition will fall away every year. Cost was the big issue in San Diego, but in 2016 they opened the largest desalination plant in the world, and 15 more are already planned. The other objection came from environmentalists because they didn't like the amount of pollution created by burning fossil fuels to create the energy that would go into the desalination. But that objection will be solved going forward with co-located solar farms. So here too I believe that growth is accelerating and the second derivative is only starting to become appreciated. The key takeaway is that US capacity will take off over the next 10 years, and that's based upon clear precedent. Again, going back to solar, if you look at installed capacity, it took 25 years for solar to reach 1% of global energy capacity. It then only took the past 2.5 years for it to double to 2%. We've had 50x growth in the past 10 years, and that's right in the time frame that solar became cost competitive. Now, if you extend that trend another 10 years, then solar will dominate the energy market before 2030. So, unless we invent an even more powerful energy solution in that time, then I see solar becoming virtually the entire market. If the same growth rate applied to desalination, we'd be looking at global saturation by 2025, just 6 years away. I don't think it's going to happen quite that fast globally, but it could for the US. And if you don't think that's possible, just look at how fast solar is growing in Minnesota once costs drop below grid parity.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty fast. Now, as you mentioned before, desalination costs about 80 cents per cubic meter today, and it will fall to about 50 cents within 5 years. I know you said that desalination plants would not necessarily have to pump all this water into the interior, right? But if they did, about how much would that cost?
Well, it depends on the elevation of the receiving state. West Texas would be the cheapest at about 5 cents extra, and Wyoming would be the most expensive at about 25 cents extra, using today's cost of energy. Using the projected cost of energy in 5 years, those numbers would fall to 3 cents and 8 cents respectively. So you would still be under 50 cents per cubic meter total in 5 years. So now you've solved a water problem in the Southwest. That would be sufficient to consider the land for agricultural use. An average farmland goes for about $4,000 per acre. We're buying at $150 to $400 per acre. So that's about a 10 to 20-fold gain with a 7 or 8 year time frame. Even if we cut that figure in half to say $2,000, then we're still expecting about a 5-fold gain at bare minimum.
That's a pretty nice return. What about residential development?
With residential, you get much higher values. The average cost per acre across the country, which includes the basically worthless land, the kind that we're buying, is $6,500 per acre. That's a realistic figure to expect. So then we're talking about a 30-fold return before inflation. And that's not bad for a 5 to 10 year holding period, especially when you're sidestepping technological risk, operational risk, and competitive risk.
Okay. No, I mean, that sounds reasonable. However, this assumes that there will be people willing to move to these largely unpopulated areas, even if they were lush and green at that point.
Right, well, that's certainly a big if, but there's good reason to believe it will happen. I mean, this gets into other technological trends that bear directly on the population density issue. And the first has to do with self-driving cars, and it's called Marchetti's Wall.
What will self-driving cars do to our cities? The answer comes from an unlikely place, an Italian physicist named Cesare Marchetti. What Marchetti observed, now called Marchetti's Wall, is that cities grow or sprawl as transportation improves. Let's see how this works. Most ancient cities were less than 5 kilometers. This is how far 1 hour of walking can get you. But then transportation technology improved. Each time the dominant transit technology changed, The size of cities changed with it. But one thing stayed the same. The typical person still spent about 1 hour in transit. That hour just got you further. Marchetti's big insight was that when mobility gets better, people choose to spread out rather than reduce their travel time. Now the big question: how far will self-driving cars push out Marchetti's wall? How much will we sprawl? Here's how far 45 minutes and 5 p.m. traffic will get you in San Francisco today. This might be how far a typical person is willing to live who needs to commute to the city. In a self-driving world, some new places may start to feel within striking distance. The details of our self-driving future are still fuzzy, but Marchetti tells us this is likely to be true. Cities will sprawl, convenience will matter less, and people will flock to cheaper or nicer places that were once seen as too far.
Okay, so you think that self-driving cars will cause people to move far enough away from the city that they move into Terraform's holdings?
For some of the properties we're buying, yes, because they're close enough to a major city for that phenomenon to work. Though I think in this case, it's hard to estimate how big of an improvement self-driving cars will be for commuting. I mean, the key advance is that you don't have to drive at all. So car interiors will feel more like living rooms. You could read a book, sleep, or work on a report while you're in transit. So I definitely think it will extend the suburbs out significantly. So while rural land should go up in value, I see self-driving technology having a deflationary effect on real estate prices within the city. We are already seeing very modest anecdotal effects due to Uber and Lyft, which people are just beginning to notice.
We also need to focus on the secondary and tertiary effects of technology, of new exponential transportation technologies. For instance, consider this. If cars are going to be driving themselves and you can Uber or Lyft them whenever you need to, what could this potentially do to real estate prices? Think about it. They should go down. If your time in the car is not wasted, because your time in the car is productive, you don't need to be driving, you can rest, you can watch that movie, you can get work done. You don't care how far, maybe you don't care as much how far away from home, work, from social life you live. You basically become a little more indifferent to distance. And supply of viable real estate goes up, demand is the same. We should see asset price compression. In markets where Lyft and Uber are very active, there is already evidence of asset price compression in rental markets. And rental prices tend to be a leading indicator of real estate prices. I think there's precedent for this. In Amsterdam, if you drive outside of the city for about 15 minutes, real estate prices drop by 50%. And furthermore, I think the world's first self-driving car has already demonstrated this effect. What was the world's first self-driving car? I think it was the elevator. The elevator was a self-driving car. It made us indifferent to distance. With the advent of the elevator, you didn't care which floor you lived on. You didn't try to be as close as possible to the ground floor. You could go further and further away. In fact, being further away became a sign of prestige. What the elevator did vertically, I think self-driving cars are going to do horizontally, and it'll be a very, very different world. And again, I want to remind us that exponential technologies create exponential winners and exponential losers. And we need to keep this in perspective. The notion of home and what you do from home is also changing the landscape of transportation. If you think about work and shop, working and shopping is progressively happening more and more at home, from the home. The year 2017 is the first moment in history in the US when more people bought online than offline. And this is a massive demarcation in the history of retail. 2019 is projected to be the first year when more people will work from home than from a commercial office. What does this do to our roads? When the marginal cost of transportation drops the way we expect it to, things will tend to come to you instead of you going to them. So on the roads, we expect a very massive highway for transportation of goods.
Okay, I know you have a pretty pessimistic view of the future of work. So how does that play into this?
Right. I think technological unemployment will be a major issue by the mid-20s. Between now and then, we're going to have a massive recession and a currency crisis. I'm not going to get into why because that's too long of a discussion. But when we start coming out of that recession, I think we'll see a true jobless recovery. Rather than hire back human workers, most companies will be replacing them with AI and robotics. Remember, I watch this space closely, and we have investments in these very technologies. And you don't need to take my word for it either. You can listen to Elon Musk, the Google guys, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and most of the tech CEOs in Silicon Valley. Here's a clip from Elon Musk.
There will be fewer and fewer jobs that a robot cannot do better.
Okay.
What to do about mass unemployment? This is going to be a massive social challenge. And I think ultimately we will have to have some kind of universal basic income. I don't think we're going to have a choice.
Universal basic income.
Universal basic income. I think it's going to be necessary.
So it means that unemployed people will be paid across the globe.
Yeah.
Because there is no job, machine, robot is taking over.
That's simply and I want to be clear that these are not things that I think that I wish would happen. These are simply things that I think probably will happen.
Yeah, I've heard that argument, and it sounds pretty reasonable to me.
So then, what happens to cities?
Yeah, I know you think they'll depopulate. So do you want to explain why you think that'll happen?
Right, people losing their jobs can't afford to live in cities. Rents are higher, taxes are higher, food costs more. Basically, everything is more expensive, especially real estate. As an extreme example, guess what one hypothetical acre of land costs next to the Empire State Building?
How much?
$90 million in 2007. That comes out to $2,000 per square foot.
I mean, that's just crazy. And I know that super high-end real estate in the city goes for as high as 15 to 20,000 per square foot in some buildings.
Right, and it makes buying at less than half a penny per square foot of raw land seem pretty cheap.
Right. I mean, I get your point. The cities will depopulate because of mass unemployment. Fewer people will be able to afford the city, so they'll be moving to our arid land areas.
Yeah, exactly. I know some people say that they like the city because of museums, shows, entertainment, and all that. But in reality, studies have shown that 80% of the decision as to where to live is economics. All other factors make up only 20% of that decision. So don't be fooled. Cities will depopulate and there will be a mass migration out to the suburbs, and most will push out to rural areas where the cost of living is really cheap. What other option will there be?
Right. It makes sense. So what effect will universal basic income have in all this?
UBI won't fully solve the structural problem, and the amount provided by UBI will likely be something around $1,000 per month, at least to begin with. It will be enough to live on, but not in the city. UBI will already be unpopular enough with the remaining taxpayers.
Right, right. So I guess there would be a big demand for affordable housing as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And where will the housing be most affordable? What region of the U.S. dominates the bottom quartile of the cost of living index? That would be the Southwest.
Right. I get your point. So what about timing, though? You said that tech unemployment will be a big issue by the mid-2020s. That's sooner than a lot of people expect. Is there data to back this up?
Yeah, this is the real hurdle in most people's minds. Nobody intuitively appreciates exponentials because they didn't apply during 99% of our evolution. We evolved in a linear world, so we're wired to think that way. But the data for this exponential phenomenon are very solid, and it encompasses a much bigger number of technologies than just Moore's Law.
Right. I remember we did a whole podcast on this topic.
Right, and that data show that by 2029, tech unemployment will be a massive problem, where well more than half of the population is unemployed. That's only 10 years away. At that point, what will a human be able to do that AI and robotics can't? And whatever your answer is, it will not provide a living for 90% of the workers who are displaced, particularly when the rate of change is so dramatic.
Okay. So you see this technological advancement is pushing people out of the cities and into inexpensive rural areas. Are you seeing this happen on a wide scale by, say, 2025, the mid-2020s, as you said?
Yeah, I believe it'll begin in about 3 years as the next recession gets underway. Now, I don't think people will migrate en masse to desert areas until they are being cheaply irrigated, and I see that taking about 5 years. So that's one of the reasons why we are likely to begin seeing really impressive returns in about 7 or 8 years.
All right. Well, that will make it a long-term play. And I mean, real estate's a liquid. So what do you have to say to that?
Well, 2 points to that. First, if you bought the S&P at the dead bottom in 2009 and then sold today, almost 10 years later, you'd have made about 4.5 times your money. So I'm talking about 10 to 30-fold returns over a similar time period. That greater return should compensate anyone for the liquidity issue. And second, have investments become more or less liquid over time? Obviously, they become more liquid, and technology is again the reason. Shares in private companies are trading on secondary markets, and you can just look at Uber and Airbnb as the big ones, but there's many smaller ones that are also trading shares on secondary markets. And the same thing is happening with real estate. There will be an opportunity to liquefy our equity before long. We can either list our company as a public stock, or we can do it via crypto exchanges. There are currently about 50 real estate cryptos that are launching on public exchanges over the next 12 months. These allow you to own fractional ownership in all kinds of real estate, including residential and commercial properties, stuff you would normally consider very illiquid, but it will trade hands on public exchanges. Now, I'm not saying we are set on taking one of these two paths, but I would be surprised if we didn't get a great opportunity to do so in the next 5 years.
So are there any existing public companies that are doing exactly the same thing that you're talking about here?
No, when I first went down this road, I first looked to see if anybody else was doing this on a significant scale in a public equity, and that just doesn't exist. We are one of the very first to recognize this opportunity for what it is.
Okay, so let's assume you're right on this. How do you select the correct properties?
So everything we've talked about so far are the big macro considerations. On a micro level, we have a long checklist of specific items we're looking for, which include geography, geology, topology, soil type, proximity to certain resources, or growing commercial ventures. We also look for special situations where we see a local catalyst that could be significant. But one thing I'll be very specific about is contamination. We do not want to be located near any contamination zone, landfill, or anything that will either endanger a person's health or require any serious remediation effort due to some prior owner's actions. We research these properties very closely. I even go onto the web to see what kind of cancer rates are prevalent in the local area. Fortunately, on a statewide level, the rates of cancer in the Southwest region are the lowest in the country. Of the 8 states we are interested in, at least 7 of them rank in the lowest 8 spots on the list, which is incredible. It may actually be all 8, but the CDC doesn't have data for Nevada. Finally, the local issues are very important. Each property we look at has to have a clear catalyst that we can see that makes it special to us, but may not be obvious to anyone else. I'm not going to discuss those things publicly because we don't want to produce bidding competition.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered solar energy, desalination, autonomous cars, technological unemployment, AI and robotics, and you also mentioned cryptocurrencies in the context of digitizing land investing. And I know we skipped over many others that you believe are important. But how many of these themes actually have to play out for this strategy to work as you expect?
Just one, lower energy costs being driven by advances in solar. That single technology makes so many other things possible that it's hard to overstate it. All of the other technological themes are additive from there. They're a bonus, in many cases a huge bonus, but cheap energy alone is sufficient to transform the desert.
So are there any last items you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, I've looked at this from every angle I can imagine, and I've not had greater conviction for any investment project before. This one is also the most important I can imagine given the future we're quickly speeding toward. Again, I don't think this is a land investment, it's a technological investment. It's a bet on exponential technological change. All of the exponential technologies I've looked at, robotics, nanotech, even synthetic biology, all affect land in ways you wouldn't normally think about. And fortunately, virtually all of them benefit our thesis.
Right, which is that ultimately rural land will increase in value while developed urban property will decrease in value over time.
Right, and the major macro catalyst we talked about today was solar. Solar undoubtedly has a big future, but here's a chart of the specific competing technologies in the space.
Yeah, that's a lot of technologies there.
Right, and you can try your luck picking the winners, or you can bet on the growth of the whole industry without taking competitive risk, technology risk, or operational risk. That's the point of Terraform.
That's great.
And I'm happy to discuss with anyone who's interested.